Welcome back to the NSP. I'm your host, Chris Ayotte. On this episode, I'm joined by Perrin Beatty. Originally from Fergus, Ontario, Perrin's family arrived from Ireland in the 1820s, and his ancestors started Beatty Brothers Limited, which grew into a major international agriculture and home appliance company. Perrin caught the political bug at the age of 12 when he helped out in a local campaign. A decade later, he was a member of Parliament and stayed in the House of Commons for 21 years. During that time, he filled 7 different ministerial positions. After politics, he led the CBC and then the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Before we get to our guest, a word from our partner for this episode and a member of the Veteran Volunteerism Initiative, Team Rubicon. As a part of the NSP's continued effort to support veteran businesses and charities, listen to how you can continue to serve by helping communities in need.
Attention to all who have served and are ready to serve again. Team Rubicon Canada is calling. We are a veteran-led group serving communities before, during, and after disasters and crises. Join forces with us and fellow veterans, first responders, and skilled civilians as humanitarians. Embrace a new uniform and a united purpose, helping communities through their darkest hours. We're looking for warriors driven to make a difference, those who don't mind getting their hands dirty and who thrive in a team. If that sounds like you, there's a gray shirt waiting for you. Your skills and experience in crises aren't just valued here, they're vital. With Team Rubicon, you'll tackle emergencies with precision and grit. You'll also be joining a community and culture of like-minded professionals built for service. To learn more or to enlist, visit us at teamrubicon.ca/volunteer or follow us at Team Rubicon Can. Team Rubicon Canada. Real challenges, real missions, real impact. Think you've got what it takes? Start your journey with Team Rubicon today and earn your shirt.
And now, my friends, here's my conversation with Perrin Beatty. Perrin, thanks for being on the podcast, and I really appreciate you inviting me into your home.
Thank you. Glad to have you.
And we were talking previously about, I love this area of Ottawa, but how did you come about end up in this house?
I came here during the time that I was in Parliament for 21 years. I lived in Fergus. We had an apartment in Ottawa, and I would commute up to Ottawa. After the 93 election, I didn't anticipate that I would ever be coming back here. My intention was to move to the private sector. But then Jean Chrétien asked me to become president of CBC, and head office was here in Ottawa. So in 1995, we bought here.
Okay, so you would have probably never returned to Ottawa had that opportunity not presented itself.
It was fully my intention to close the door, turn my back on Ottawa, focus on the private sector.
Yeah.
But I did my career entirely differently from most people. Most people would do their career in the private sector first and then run for Parliament later. I did it the other way around.
Yeah, I guess that's the case. You don't really think about that too much. You just see the parliamentarians there. But I guess if you were to do a bit of an analysis, that would be very much the sort of archetype of build a bit of a career and then enter politics.
Yeah, and I was 21 at the time that I decided to run for Parliament. I'd been working at Queen's Park as an assistant to the then Minister of Health. And I went to him and said, some folks from back home have asked whether I would be interested in running for Parliament in the next election. What's your advice? What he said to me was, do it. You've got to either do it now when you can run and afford to lose, or wait until after you've paid off the mortgage and your kids have gone to school and you have the flexibility that you can move into politics at that time. He said, I'd advise you to do it now.
You already mentioned Fergus, which is a great start in the family because, I didn't know a lot about you other than you as a politician before we connected and I started to look into your background and we chatted previously. And your family history in Canada fascinates me. It's really, really neat. So maybe you start off giving the listener a little bit of an understanding of when your family came to Canada, what Beatty Brothers is and Fergus. Sure. and that story.
Sure, and we're all very much a product of our roots. And we as Canadians, we have a myth that we're a northern country. We're not. We live like weather stripping along the U.S. border. But so many of us who were born here can trace our roots back to small town or rural Canada. And our values come from there. And mine are certainly small town values. Our family came from Ireland, probably in the late 1820s. They settled in the Brampton area. My great-grandfather was born here. He apprenticed to work in building farm equipment with a firm in the area, but was unhappy with the quality of equipment being built, felt that he could improve it. And he and his brother got a tax holiday from the town of Fergus to create a foundry there where they could build equipment. So my great-grandfather designed the farm equipment and manufactured it, and his brother was the salesman who went out with a flatbed wagon to the farmers in the area and sold the equipment to the farmers in the surrounding area. And the company built from there. It went into other forms of farm equipment, but also pumps, water heaters, family appliances, and so on. And it not only sold right across Canada, but right around the world.
When you say design, that's really cool. So I'm assuming that that was designed based on experience, not necessarily formal education.
That's true. But my grandfather, who succeeded my great-grandfather as president of the company, was a graduate of the Toronto School of Practical Engineering.
Okay.
And so that now is the U of T engineering faculty. But that was the early days of it. And my grandfather was something of an inventive genius. He had, according to one of the local histories, he had more patents registered after his name than anybody else in Canada. It's certainly numbered in the hundreds. And it was interesting, I was looking at an article, which I'll leave you, but I can't leave to your listeners, unfortunately, about the history of the firm that was written 90 years ago in, I believe it was in the Financial Times.
Yep.
And it described the development of the firm and the family's role in it, the role that it played in the community. And so many of the issues that are discussed here of intellectual property, of entrepreneurship, of innovation, of the company's responsibility to the community in which it operates and to its workers. These, also exporting is another one. These are issues that are as important and contemporary today as they were 90 years ago. It's fascinating to see that the issues that I wrestle with at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce are the issues that stood out in the development of our own family business.
I think that's a really important lesson and message for people is you don't have to dig particularly deep to realize that most of the things that challenges we're dealing with have been enduring for years and years. Personal challenges, professional challenges, challenges of the nation. I mean, most of these things are not new. They may have a new wrapper on them.
Yep.
But ultimately, a lot of them are not new.
Unfortunately, every generation believes that it discovered fire by itself. And you see it in politics as well, where when a government gets elected, the wind is really in their sails, they're feeling good about themselves, and they're convinced that they've discovered something that nobody else knew before, and that they're smarter than anybody before. That's the hubris that gets built into the system that encourages people to spend too much time reading their own press and feeling they're smarter than they really are. Then they get mugged by reality.
So what I'll do is, for the listeners, I'll put this article Perrin's given me here in the show notes. I'll link it in there so you can go find it. And I like because I'd read this about the electric agitator washer somewhere. How did the company go from farm machinery, heavy machinery, to washing machine, like first washing machines? The
Iron Horse agitator in that washing machine with a copper tub in it was invented by my grandfather. And there was a good deal of debate over the intellectual property with American companies on this as well. What had happened is the marketplace changed. And we stayed in farm equipment, but we moved away from focusing on the equipment itself, the reapers and so on, that you might otherwise have been selling, to things like barn equipment and stabling equipment. And then also recognized that there was a whole new opportunity as it was developing to get into home appliances. One of the things that there used to be is that each year Beatty Brothers would put out, both in Britain and in Canada, a Beatty Barn Book. And what it would do is to look at the most advanced farms in the countries and how Beatty equipment was being used. But it literally was a hardcover book that was updated each year and was designed to encourage farmers to look at the most modern technology. I remember as a boy going to the Royal Winter Fair, and the stabling there in the Royal Winter Fair in Toronto was Beatty Brothers Stabling from Fergus. You'll see Beatty Brothers windmills still around on farms, and you'll see old green hand pumps in farms and cabins. And if you look at it, it may say BT Fergus on it. That's from our family's firm.
So, I mean, this is the sort of paternal lineage of the family. And what's your mom's background? Where did your mom come from?
My name Perrin is actually Perrin. Her family were French Huguenots, French Protestants who were persecuted in France and fled to Britain, and then subsequently came to Canada, settled in the Peterborough area. And then my mom and dad met each other at Victoria College, first year of Victoria College at the University of Toronto.
And what did your mom's family, what was their family business?
Her family invested in properties and managed real estate and so on. So it was quite different from the manufacturing background that my father's family had.
We'd spoken earlier, and you were talking about how you sort of initially got the political bug.
I am, by the way, it would be of interest to you because of your military background. I'm named after my uncle, my mother's brother, Henry Perrin, who is buried in Holland at the Canadian Cemetery in Holton.
Okay.
He was killed just a few weeks before the end of World War II in the liberation of Holland. And, it was an incredibly moving experience for me so many years later as Minister of National Defence to come back and visit that grave and to look at the age of the Canadians who were buried there. He was 22 at the time. And you realize how fortunate those of us who were born after the war were, and the scope of the sacrifice that people of the previous generation had been called upon to make.
Was that level of sort of gratitude or well understood in your family because you had somebody who had served and died in the war? Did you find that was an attitude that was more pervasive as you were growing up, as understanding and being grateful for that?
With that generation. And of course, there were many people then still alive who had served in war. So it was not a matter of history. It wasn't a memory that was fading into the past. And there even, when I was first elected to Parliament, there were still veterans of World War I. One of my best workers, Jack Milligan in Fergus, who was the first mayor of Fergus, had been a World War I veteran. They were, of course, dying off at that point, but the World War II vets were very much alive. Also, in my constituency, my hometown was Fergus. Just to the north of there was Drayton, which is the center of a large Dutch-Canadian immigrant population, people who came over after the war and whose memories of the war and of the Canadian liberation of Holland remain very strong. And it was a remarkable experience for me one time when I was Minister of National Defence, because the Dutch ambassador was a good friend of mine, and I brought him to Drayton, to this rural community populated by Dutch Canadians, and brought a Canadian Forces band. We went into the arena, opened it up to the community, and when the two national anthems were played, you could see the fierce pride that these Dutch Canadians had, both in their Dutch heritage and in their Canadian citizenship that they had today. And there was no contradiction between the two. They were part of the same personality. And it spoke volumes to me about how we should be seeing ourselves as Canadians.
I was tilting at your early political interest, but maybe I'll ask another question before that. And so were you immersed in Beatty Brothers? I mean, this must have been, it was a main employer in Fergus. Obviously, it's a family business. Was there a pull to be part of that business before you decided to go into politics?
I would have been, but my father died when I was 10. And if he hadn't, I expected I would have gone into business with him as he had with his father, and as his father had with his father. But that wasn't an option. We sold our interest in the firm after my dad died, and went on to people, if they look in their basement today, may very well see that they have a GSW water heater in the basement. It may say Fergus, Ontario on it. That was built in the Beatty plant. And what happened is that when we sold, the people who bought it then used Beatty's money as well, bought Moffat, McClary, Easy, and General Steelwares, which were all appliance manufacturers, and then recreated the company as GSW Limited. Okay.
So was that a sale out of necessity or just an interest to do something different?
Well, it was that generation had ended with the death of my father.
Okay.
And so for myself and for my siblings, it just wasn't an option. And it made sense to go ahead and do this. My dad had been looking in any case at whether he wanted to get out of a company that size and restart a business with his own children. Because what had happened as you go through the generations, more and more members of the family get involved, and the direction of the company becomes more and more dissipated as a consequence. And he found it appealing to think of possibly starting over again.
Okay.
But he didn't have that option, and we certainly didn't, given our ages.
I mean, you've probably seen this in your time with the Chamber of Commerce and in the business world, but those with that entrepreneurial spirit are always looking for that next thing to build and create.
It's true.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that's often missed when people look at business is the role of business as a creative activity. People see it as being bloodless and mathematical in its nature. It's not. For the people whom I've met, who are the most successful business people, they see it as a form of artistry in itself, where their efforts, their creativity, can create something that wouldn't have existed before, or can build it to a size or in a form factor that just wouldn't have been possible. So some people may go into the arts or into other elements of activity. For many people in the business community, this is a means of expressing their own creativity and their desire to build something.
Yeah, it's. I think it's one of the things, at least I experienced inside the military, was inability to maybe hold a couple of ideas in your mind at the same time. Is that, yes, businesses need to make money for a whole bunch of practical reasons, but that's not the only thing that people are in business for. There's a creative aspect for it. In terms of defense, I bump into a lot of people in the defense industry who truly want to see the men and women of the Canadian military have the best capabilities
Yes.
they can have.
Yes.
And that, I think that goes across all types of industries, as people want to contribute in a meaningful way through business, through their creativity. It's an outlet for a lot of things, not just making money.
Absolutely. And the survival of our free enterprise system depends upon that. The capitalist system, I'm a strong believer in capitalism. It's a highly efficient system. It's one that I believe promotes freedom. It's one that obviously raises living standards both in Canada and around the world. But it doesn't exist for its own sake. It exists because of what it can do. And if we lose touch with the connection that we have with a larger society, it can die. When the day comes that ordinary people feel that the system isn't serving them, that it's beneficial only to a small group of people who are in control of it, the system will die. And as a result, then, we need, those of us in the business community, to continue to see our businesses as part of the broader society and as contributing to the betterment of society in a whole variety of different ways. That was the ethic that really drove my grandfather. And he never saw a distinction between the company and the community in which it operated. For example, during the Depression, this was hard times for the company. But he worked to keep one breadwinner from every family on the payroll. He said, it's the guys on the line that made this company what it is during the good times. We have an obligation to them during the tough times. And he always felt that way. He felt that we had a responsibility both as a family and as a business to continue to put back into the broader community. So there were a couple of children, a couple of boys who were drowned in the Grand River that bisects Fergus. It runs right down the center of Fergus. My grandfather was horrified by this, and so he built a municipal swimming pool for the town. He built it across from our lower plant, which was on the Grand River, in the downtown section of Fergus, ran heating conduits across from the boilers in the plant, so there was actually heated water for the swimming pool. And he ran it at a loss out of Beatty Brothers' money to make sure that anybody in town would be able to use this municipal pool and nobody would have to swim in the river again. And as a result, Fergus became, if not the first, one of the first small communities in Ontario to have its own swimming pool. This wasn't something that was a PR gesture on his part. He felt an obligation as somebody who could make a difference to do so.
Yeah, the PR gesture is an interesting one, because my sense is these days is there's probably not too many altruistic gestures that escape the cynicism of, well, that you're just doing that for PR, as opposed to people who actually are genuinely doing it to try and make the communities better.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. Too often it looks like it's something that's been dreamed up by the PR department,
right,
when companies do things. But when the Depression hit, my grandfather had just bought a brand new car. He took it and he put it up in blocks on the garage, in the garage. And he said, until the men in the line can afford to drive to work, I will not. And he walked to work like everyone else. He would go back to the plant in the middle of the night often. And one night he was walking through the plant during the Depression and found somebody stealing coal from the furnaces. Could have had him arrested. Instead, what he said to him was, you'll damage your furnace, it's the wrong type of coal. And the next day he arranged to have a ton of coal delivered to this person's home. This wasn't something done for publicity or to try to create good feelings. It was because he felt he had an obligation, and that obligation was particularly acute because everything that we had was the product of other people's effort and ideas and dedication.
I think that's a really important framing about how your grandfather saw that their well-being was, based on other people's hard work as well as their own. It wasn't just sort of independent of anybody else. And I think that sort of framing really can help drive a leader to make those sort of decisions and to live a life of value.
It's true. Society's changed a lot since that time. It was also a much more paternalistic environment as well. The whistle on the factory blew in the morning to tell the men that it was time to come into work. I'm not sure most communities, they would like to have the whistle going off first thing in the morning. Fergus was dry. There was no alcohol, at least officially, during the time that my family was active there, because our family was very much involved in the temperance movement. Our family was very much involved in the United Church. My grandfather, when he heard that the hall beside the United Church, where Sir John A. Macdonald had once come and spoken in an election campaign, was up for sale and that someone was looking at possibly turning it into a tavern, bought it and gave it to the church to prevent that from happening. Elora, 3 miles away, was wet. Fergus was dry during that time. After my family had passed from the scene, there was a local plebiscite, and where the town voted to go wet, and it was instructive to me to see how many people were able to make that transition very easily.
I have no doubt. Now maybe we'll transition to the political side. You told me a story about how your first sort of, when you bumped up against politics when you were 12. I think it was, were you at a movie theater with friends?
I was. Those were in the days when every small town had a movie theater, and it was 25 cents to see a movie in those days. And a friend and I went down to the Grand Theater in Fergus and saw a movie. We came out. It was dark, and in those days, stores didn't stay open late. There was a light on one of the stores on the main street. So being curious 12-year-olds, we went across and stuck our faces in the windows, tried to see what was happening. And inside was the family lawyer who saw me and recognized me and beckoned us in. It turned out to be the PC headquarters in the 1962 election. And Bill Maydell, who was the family lawyer, asked whether I'd be willing to help out in the campaign. So you could see the posters that I put up on lampposts because they were about 2 feet lower than anyone that anybody else had put in. But that was my start in politics. And people years later used to ask me, well, you're a progressive conservative, you must have given a lot of thought and weighed all of the differences between the political parties and decided this was the appropriate one. What, tell us about the process. Well, my answer was always, well, it just happened to be the store with the light on across from the movie theater when I came out at age 12. I couldn't have conceived at that point that 10 years later I would be sitting in Parliament. But there's a story that I haven't told people before that goes back to Bill Maydell as well, in that after years later he became a judge, and my mum was in Guelph and bumped into him on the street, and he extended his hand and he said to my mum, "Shake hands with me," and which she did. And when she pulled her hand back, there was a $10 bill in it. And he said, "That's for Perrin's campaign, but if you ever tell anybody that I gave it to you, I'll deny it." So the confession I make here is my political start was with an illegal donation from a judge. And I've tried to overcome that since.
So what about politics interested you? Because clearly when you have, a family friend, a family lawyer who's like, "Hey, can you help out?" I mean, that's one thing. But then to have spent really the first part of your professional life in politics, starting at 12, I mean, what was the bug that caught you and really attracted you to that profession?
Well, first of all, it's a weird childhood. Kids that age play hockey. They don't get involved in election campaigns. But it became my hobby and my interest. And when I went to boarding school in Toronto, I got involved, for example, in Dalton Camp's campaign when he was running in Eglinton against Mitchell Sharp, who was then the foreign minister and had been finance minister as well. It was an interest that continued to deepen. But let's not kid ourselves. When you're that age, it's as much sport as it is anything else. It's not a case that you have a deep knowledge of public policy and that you have weighed all of the issues. But many of my friends whom I developed were in politics. They were members of the party. They were people with the same interests I had. And we enjoyed each other's company and felt a sense of mission. I became president of the student PCs at Western. I worked for the student newspaper, worked as a reporter for a commercial radio station. All of this fed my interest in politics. And my first job was as an assistant, during the summer, a very junior assistant to a cabinet minister at Queen's Park. But all of this then fed into this continuing interest that I had in politics. And the option, of course, of going to business with my family didn't exist. So I was going to have to make my own way. And it's a wonderful thing if your vocation can be your avocation as well. If you're able to do something that you just really love and that you've really enjoyed. So it also goes back to what was instilled in us by the example of my grandfather, that our family had an obligation to put back into the community. And this was a way of doing that. I don't portray it as all altruistic. I loved it. It was fun. But it was also satisfying to know that you were doing something that would make a difference. and could help people's lives be better. That's, the best possible job to have.
You just mentioned about how, it was the progressive conservatives because the light was on, and that's where you went. I mean, did you find at all that, once you'd picked a team, that just it all made sense, that was a good fit, or once you pick the team, that's just kind of the way you stick with it? I'm just curious because, if the light was on and it was the Liberal candidate, would it have been the same thing?
The simple answer is I don't know. I've asked myself the same question many times. I didn't weigh the options carefully and make a well-researched choice of which political party to become involved with. But as time went on, I was more and more comfortable with the place where I had ended up. Now, whether that was a result of my values being shaped by the people I was working with, or the organization I was working with having a symmetry with my values, I can't honestly say. It's probably a little bit of both. But I never felt uncomfortable with that choice. I felt that it aligned well with what I believed in, and I liked the people I was with. When I was elected to Parliament, my first leader was Robert Stanfield, he and my grandfather remain my two great heroes. Stanfield just was a person of such incredible integrity and concern for the country, and with that same sense of duty that I mentioned about my grandfather, that for a young person like me, it was simply inspirational to be able to work with.
So your first election was 72?
1992. 1972, yes.
And I guess there's a couple of things I'm interested in is, either one would be what were the issues of the day, but maybe before that. So how did you find campaigning? Were you naturally a people person that liked to interact with people, or was that something that you needed to learn as you got into the political game?
I loved it. The one thing I was always uncomfortable with was door knocking, because I felt I was intruding into somebody else's privacy. It's
very Canadian.
I would find myself very uncomfortable for the first 5 doors, and then when you saw that people were glad to see you, you started to feel more comfortable. But each day when I started, there was that unease. I still remember, by the way, in that 72 election campaign, being up in Dundalk, in the north end of my constituency, a very small town where they used to have the Canadian step dancing championships, among other things. But I was knocking on doors one night, and it turned out to be the night of the celebrated Canada-Russia hockey game.
Oh, yeah, and there it is.
When chap came to the door and opened it, I said, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Perrin Beatty. I'm the PC candidate in the next election. And his response was, "The hell with you, I'm voting for Henderson."
I was hoping he was going to invite you in and say, "Yeah, enough talking. Come in and watch the hockey game."
No, I was on to the next door, but he was convinced that I was glad I wasn't running against Henderson.
Yeah, I don't think anybody could have beat Paul Henderson back then, and some would have problems probably beating him now. So, what were the issues of the day in the 72 election? And that's, we've already talked about how nothing's particularly new. So what were the challenges and what were the issues in 72?
You really have to go back to 1968, which is when Pierre Trudeau came on the scene. It was the first contest between Pierre Trudeau and Bob Stanfield, both of whom were new leaders. And there was the phenomenon of Trudeau-mania, where there was just an electricity that Pierre Trudeau generated with the Canadian electorate. I remember, for example, one day in the 68 election where he drew probably 100,000 people to Nathan Phillips Square in Toronto at noon. Just extraordinary. Nobody had ever done that before. 4 years later, by 1972, there was a feeling of estrangement the public was feeling, that the government didn't understand them, that they were out of touch, that they had become arrogant and aloof. And the most important issue, certainly in our constituency, was the feeling that people had that it was time for a change, that the government had gotten out of touch. And as a result, on election night, it was literally a tie on election night between the PCs and the Liberals. An incredible swing in those 4 years. As a result of recounts, 3 or 4 seats shifted from the PCs to the Liberals. The Liberals then were able to go into Parliament with a minority. And the NDP supported them and kept them in office for a couple of years until they arranged to be defeated on their budget and go into the 74 election. But the fundamental political tide that was moving through the country was the sense of the government has become disconnected from us and out of touch, and we need to send them a message.
And when you got elected and you arrived in Ottawa, what were your initial impressions of your job as a parliamentarian, as the federal political system? Because now you're really, you've been drafted into the big show as it was. So what were your initial impressions as quite a young parliamentarian?
Well, the first thing was, as a young parliamentarian, I thought I was going to be told that I was going to be that my role was to be seen and not heard.
Right. So
I was determined to establish that wasn't going to be the case, and it was very noisy right from the beginning and within my own caucus. What I discovered, though, was that Parliament was a meritocracy. What my colleagues said to me was, look, we're not going to judge you on the basis of your age. You came in through the front door in the same way we did. We'll judge you on the basis of how you perform. What sort of talent you have, how hard do you work, what sort of results are there? And we were very fortunate to be able to, I was very fortunate to be able to do that and to be in an institution where a young person was fully accepted and given opportunities that I certainly couldn't have had anywhere else. The other thing that stood out to me, I was born in Southern Ontario. I was educated in Southern Ontario. Had my first job in Southern Ontario, was elected from a Southern Ontario constituency. And my perception of Canada was very much from that end of the telescope of Southern Ontario. Southern Ontario is to Canada as the United States is to the rest of the world. Others have to do business on the terms of people living there. And people within, what I found was that in going to my first caucus, that I was exposed to people from Newfoundland or from Quebec or from British Columbia who were every bit as ardent a Canadian as I was, but whose view of the country was very different. And frankly, I felt a sense of anger that I had been allowed to grow up to that stage without understanding my own country. And one of the things I was determined to do was to understand the complexity of Canada and the fact that one size doesn't fit all, and the fact that there's room for a lot of people in that house with different backgrounds and different points of view and different goals, and that the country is stronger and better for that. But it was that sense of discovering how insular you had been by when you attended your first caucus and when you started meeting people from across the country that made me convinced that an important part of my career would be to look at the country as a whole and how politics can play an integrative role to bring people together and to help people work together and to strengthen the national fabric.
So how old were you when you got elected?
22. I was 21 when I was nominated, and then 22 after the election came.
And when were you first appointed to cabinet? 29.
In Joe Clark's cabinet. I had just turned 29 a little over a week before.
Okay. Now, I think one of the things I like to do when I've got experts on the show is maybe can you give the listener a sense of the difference between caucus and cabinet and the interplay between those two? So it's a bit of a sort of politics 101.
Cabinet, of course, is the ministers whose job it is to run departments and to work directly with the Prime Minister in doing that. Members of caucus are all of the members of your political party in Parliament, including senators. Liberal Party doesn't have Liberal senators. The Conservatives do have ones that are affiliated with them. But in those days, the political parties were represented in both the Senate and the House of Commons, and at the weekly caucus each week, both MPs and senators would come together. The caucus, there was a weekly caucus, which was the plenary, where you would talk about what your strategy is for the week, share news and information about what's taking place. But most importantly, it was a chance to develop what your game plan was, both in the short term and over the longer term. There as well would be a number of caucus committees that would be struck, that if you had a particular interest in foreign affairs or in taxation or in skills or in other issues, you could belong to that particular caucus. And each department had a shadow minister as well, perhaps more than one, whose job it was to keep an eye on the department and to hold the minister to account. In the case of the cabinet, you were responsible for your own department, but you also would meet as a member of cabinet committees and also with the full cabinet regularly with the Prime Minister and colleagues. And of course, you were expected to be at caucus as well and to maintain a link with the elected members of your own party. What was interesting to me in moving from opposition to government is that in terms of the difference between being in the shadow cabinet and being in the cabinet, is that there's a greater collegiality in the shadow cabinet. You may be a shadow minister, but your life isn't defined by your role as a shadow minister. You're first and foremost a member of caucus and a colleague. Right. And the discussions that you have with your colleagues are more holistic and they're more collegial. What struck me in going into cabinet as we went into government was that you would get drawn down more into your own department. This was something that required 24 hours a day. And as a result, then, the meetings that you had with your colleagues were as Minister of National Defense with the Minister of Finance or with the Minister for Foreign Affairs, as opposed to two colleagues who happen to have shadow cabinet roles. And one of the things that I missed when we were I never would have chosen to be in opposition over being in government, but one of the things that I missed when we were in government was that there wasn't the same sense of collegiality with all of your colleagues as there was in opposition. The other thing that's interesting about politics is that short of war, there's probably no place where you develop more intense relationships than you do in politics, because it is a different form of warfare. It's not physical, but it's a battle. You are part of a team that depends upon each other, and the stakes are very high, and they matter to you. As a result, the attachments you develop are very strong, and you maintain friendships often that extend for years and years as a result of that.
And how many cabinet posts did you fill in your political career? 7.
I was Minister of State for Treasury Board under Joe Clark. That was for the 9 months of the life of that government. Right. I was the youngest cabinet minister in Canadian history to that point, and then 9 months later became the youngest former cabinet minister in Canadian history, which was a title I held for considerably longer than the first one. But then under Brian Mulroney, I was Minister of National Revenue, Solicitor General, Minister of National Defense, Minister of National Health and Welfare, Minister of Communications. And then under Kim Campbell, I was Secretary of State for External Affairs. So I think I'm the only person that I know who has served in the cabinets of who's alive today, who served in the cabinets of 3 different prime ministers.
Yeah, I did a quick rundown of some of maybe the, I won't say highlights, but some of the things that might be a little bit more well-known to Canadians about your time in politics. Repatriation of the Constitution, NAFTA, Meech-Lake Accord, ending of apartheid in South Africa, collapse of the Soviet Union, Emergencies Act. I'm sure there's a litany of others, but those are some of the ones.
Fascinating time to be there.
Yeah.
I'm usually the least educated person in whatever room I'm in. I have a past 3-year social sciences BA. And what I had done after graduating from Western was I'd wanted to take a year off and sow wild oats, go to Australia or whatever, and then come back. I was either going to become a lawyer or go to Ryerson, do a degree in radio and television arts and become a journalist, or do an MA and a PhD in Canadian history and teach history on a college campus somewhere. Didn't have the opportunity to do that because I ended up being elected to Parliament within the year, or just over a year, I guess. But to sit on the Constitution Committee, for example, and to be a part of the patriation of the Constitution and of the debates taking place about the nature of our Confederation and about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and to try to weigh the role of the courts against the role of Parliament in deciding fundamental issues. What a privilege it is for somebody who's interested in being to study history to actually be part of making it. And I remember as well when I was defense minister, you would go to nuclear planning group meetings and be filled both with a sense of horror and a sense of privilege that you were talking about the conditions under which you could have nuclear war and in which humankind could be exterminated. Terrible thing to have those discussions, but a great sense of privilege that if somebody was going to have it, that you were at the table to take part in that and to help to shape the decisions that are made. So for me, the privilege of being in Parliament, being able to be at the table during the types of debates that you just enumerated, was enormous, and I felt that privilege every day. There was not a night that I would walk away from Parliament Hill and look back at the Peace Tower without feeling a shiver down the back of my spine about how fortunate I was. But you look back and you realize that people like MacDonald and Laurier had been in those same halls, and you had the privilege to be there now. But it was also a reminder that you were a tenant, you were not an owner of that office, and that one day you'd have to be giving it back as well.
One of the things that you often hear the Americans talk about when they refer to their Constitution and they refer to the founding fathers and what they meant by the Constitution, what they meant by any of the amendments, they're trying to interpret it with so much time between when the documents were written in a generation that was quite long ago. Now, there may not have been enough time that's passed, but I'm curious as to your perspective as somebody who was part of the discussions in the repatriation of the Constitution, in the Charter, is when you look back on it now, what you believed it was, what you believed it should be, and how it's interpreted now, or how Canadians view it now, or how politicians perhaps view it now. Does it all align? Or are you seeing, like, yes, this is what we hope for, this is how we saw it unfolding, or is there times when you look at it and go, that's not really the way we wanted this built or where we hoped this would go?
It aligns substantially with what I expected, but there's significant differences as well. The courts have been much more activist in interpreting the Constitution, and particularly the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, than I had anticipated, or I believe as well, much more activist than Jean Chrétien, who was Justice Minister at the time, right, expected as well. The debate we had in our party was over the supremacy of Parliament, where you have elected representatives making decisions, versus the role of the courts, where judges would make decisions. And I incline toward the side that judges should be cautious about changing the law through interpretation. That they should try to, as much as possible, to respect what is written and is on paper as a consequence. Obviously, we can't anticipate all of the changes that are going to take place in society, and it does require that law evolve as society evolves. But I would take a small c conservative approach to that. At the end of the day, our elected representatives are accountable. If you don't like them, you can vote them out. We deliberately ensure an insularity of the courts so that they are beyond politics. The problem with that is that puts them beyond our democracy in a sense as well. It also possibly creates a situation where politicians decide, well, to avoid getting decisions that we don't want to have, we're going to stack the court with people who align with our particular ideology. That's extremely dangerous, and it undermines public support for the judiciary and for the democratic system. So courts have been more activist than I anticipated. I've also been surprised that legislatures have been able to get away with invoking the notwithstanding clause. I ultimately supported the charter. The main reason why I did was that I thought back to the War Measures Act crisis of 1970, which took place when I was at university. And when we'd had civil liberties suspended right across the country because of the crisis in Quebec, it was the most egregious suspension of civil liberties in my lifetime, still. And you had hundreds of people swept up in the dark of night in Quebec and thrown into jail without access to lawyers, and with their legal protections being stripped away. And ultimately, the killers of Pierre Laporte, the Quebec labor minister, was kidnapped and killed, and of James Cross, who was the British Trade Commissioner, were found using ordinary police techniques. People were not convicted of crimes under the War Measures Act, and yet their civil liberties had been suspended. But when it was invoked, only a handful, only the smallest number of MPs spoke out against it in Parliament. And what I drew out of that, I had supported the invocation of the War Measures Act at the time, and I had, I had reacted in the same way as most Canadians when our government tells us that there's a crisis, and that if you knew what we knew, then you'd sure support us on this. We defer to government, and we assume that what they're telling us is correct. I was very moved years later when Robert Stanfield, as he was leaving politics, was asked, what's your single greatest regret that you had about your time in politics? His response was believing Mr. Trudeau when he said the government had information that we didn't have, and supporting the invocation of the Act. All of this left me with a sense that when it's most necessary for people to speak out in favor of civil liberties, politicians are apt to be nowhere to be seen because it's unpopular to do so. And that's when it's most critical. It's when everybody else suspends judgment and just assumes that it's acceptable to sweep away basic rights that we have as Canadians. So what the development of the Charter did was to interpose a body there in the courts that was able to stand as a bulwark of civil liberties against the political temptation to simply sweep them away and under circumstances where it's popular to do so. And so I supported the Charter. I did so not without reservation, because the principle of the supremacy of Parliament was something very important to me, and the idea that the people who make the most fundamental decisions need to be accountable to the public in a democracy. But at the end of the day, on balance, I felt it was necessary to have something as a charter to stand there as a check against the abuse of power.
Yeah, I think your comment about the requirement to extend trust. If you knew what we knew, I think we all do that in life in so many different ways. It's certainly something in the army. I think as a young leader, you quickly understand is that you have this breadth of skills that your team has, and your role is not to be an expert in them. So you do have to extend trust that people are going to do their job and they're going to do what they say they're going to do. But then you also have a responsibility to verify.
Yes.
And I think that trust but verify, the verify piece, and then probably the extension becomes and hold accountable.
Yes.
Is really important. And I get a sense that we've lost some of that, because that verify and then hold accountable trust is something that you can do, say, easily. Doesn't take any action. You just accept something and say, okay, whether you're consciously or unconsciously. But the verify and accountable takes a lot of work.
Very much so. And if you look at our political system today, one of the things that's broken down is accountability. We've always had the principle of ministerial accountability for the department that a minister runs, where anything that was good, the minister would take credit for. Anything that was wrong, the minister had to accept accountability for. What we've done is to diffuse that. We've said that ministers can't be responsible for everything that are in their department. They can't know everything that's going on. And it's unfair to hold them accountable. And time after time, when there's a scandal of or simply a wrong decision that's been made, you'll hear the politicians pointing a finger at a rogue civil servant, or at somebody who forgot to tell them something, or about something that was missed. And because I didn't make the decision, I'm not accountable for this. We've created officers of Parliament who are commissioners, in essence, of public morality, the ethics commissioner. We've moved from a standard in judging politicians today, where the standard used to be, did they do the right thing, to did the person clear it with the ethics commissioner beforehand? Was it permitted under the act? And the issue is, I spoke to the ethics commissioner, he said it was okay, so I did it. The debate should not be over that. It should be over, did you do what was ethical and proper? Was it something that was honorable? And as a result, we have diffused accountability in the system, where everybody from the Prime Minister to the person who polishes the brass on the handrails in the House of Commons shares the accountability. And it means that when everybody's accountable, nobody's accountable. Just to give you an example that you'll be well aware of, when I was Defence Minister, Lord Carrington, Peter Carrington, was the Secretary General of NATO. It was worth crossing the Atlantic just for his after-dinner speeches, which were so wonderful. But he had been in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet. As things heated up in the Falklands between the UK and Argentina, he had given the advice to the government that he believed, based on the advice he had received, that the Argentinians would not invade the Falklands. They did, and Britain went to war. As a result, Peter Carrington tendered his resignation from Margaret Thatcher's cabinet. They were extremely close. Thatcher asked him not to do it. She said, this was honest, that you gave your best assessment, and it wasn't a matter you did anything wrong, and I need you. And his response was, this is a matter of honor. I gave the wrong advice, and I have to accept the consequences for that and the accountability. So he resigned. When was the last time that you saw a politician, as a matter of honor, saying, I accept the responsibility for what took place, even if it wasn't fully under my control, and as a matter of honor, I believe that I have to step down?
Is it going to do anything by stepping down? Don't know, but is it the right thing to do? Well, I guess everybody has to measure that in their own way, but I think your point is well taken, that when was the last time you saw anybody step down as a matter of honor or a matter of principle?
And I would differentiate between honor and principle in this sense. Honor relates very much to accountability. In the case of principle, it can be, I profoundly disagree with what is being done, and as a result, I can't associate myself with it. I think there's more room in that latter category to debate precisely what you're talking about. If I do step down, do I lose the ability to actually make a difference. I have a friend who resigned from cabinet on a matter of principle some years ago. I'm still angry with him for doing it. I admire him because of it, and I'm angry. Because what I said to him at the time, he sought my advice, which he proceeded as was his right to reject. But I said to him, the fact that you're torn by conscience, that you don't see this as black and white, that you go to bed and lose sleep at night, that's precisely the quality that we need to have in people in high office. And if you resign, you'll be replaced by a robot who doesn't have these conscience pangs and who isn't torn about doing the right thing, and who believes that holding the office and being loyal is the most important thing, as opposed to being principled. It's much more of a judgment call between the two. There's certainly instances where you don't believe that in honor you can be associated with a position or with an action being taken by government, and that's straightforward. But there's a gray area there if I'm uncomfortable with it, but on the whole, I believe that my remaining in government allows me to make a difference that I couldn't make outside.
Yeah, I wonder if they parse it that finely, and I think these discussions are really important because I agree. I think there is a difference. Do you think people spend that much time thinking about the difference between honor or resigning in principle and separate those, or do they kind of blend into one for some people?
They tend to blend into one, but I guess they have to confront it if they're dealing with the situation. There's many a time that I wrestled with my conscience, and I asked myself, have I done the right thing? And particularly when I compromised, I would ask myself, have I gone too far in the compromise? Should I have refused to do so? I think it's a good thing if people feel torn. I worry about the people who don't lose sleep at night and who don't worry about whether they've done the right thing and who are just absolutely convinced that their behavior is beyond question. The fact is that for so many of the issues that we're involved in, particularly ones with an element of morality in them, it's not clear cut. It's a matter of finding a balance, and it requires compromise. And we often can feel very uncomfortable with the compromises we make. And it's only when we step back and have some perspective that we're able to decide whether we did the right thing or not. Pardon me. You may know earlier than that. If you feel bad about what you've done, you know you did the wrong thing. You never go wrong by doing the right thing. But the right thing isn't necessarily to quit the field and to say, I'm not prepared to compromise, I'm not prepared to swallow hard and to do what I can to make things better.
I'm conscious of time, and I do want to get to your role in the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and the open letter you wrote to the Prime Minister. But I think I would be missing a golden opportunity if I didn't sort of get your perspective on Brian Mulroney. And I know you're going to be talking about him later today. But maybe just to get a bit of a sense of your thoughts on the man as a person, as a politician, and yeah.
I knew that Brian that his health wasn't good, and I knew that he'd had a very close call previously. But I was shocked nonetheless by the news that he had died. I think when we see a figure who's so commanding, who's had such an impact on our countries and global affairs, we assume that somehow they'll go on forever, and we're not prepared to understand that they're going to be leaving us. And so I was shocked, and the last 2 weeks have been period of considerable introspection for me to think back about the time that we spent together and to look at how history will judge him, and also to look at how the system has changed today from the one that I was privileged to be part of, and what sort of lessons we can draw out of Brian Mulroney's experience for what he did right, what he did wrong. First of all, I worked very hard against Brian at the 2 leadership conventions he ran in. I was not his supporter at the time that he ran for leader. I supported Joe Clark. And I fully expected after the 1984 leadership convention that I would be sent into exile and that my political career might very well have been over. It was the opposite, in that he reached out to me and to others who'd supported Joe and brought us into the center. And I asked him about it one day, and he said, look, the day that the convention was over, a page was turned. We're on the same team, and what's history is history. It's where we go from here. That developed in me an intense loyalty to somebody whose instincts were that. It's interesting watching in political parties after leadership conventions. Bill Davis did the same thing, where he almost lost the leadership in 1970 in Ontario to Al Lawrence. But then he reached out, brought in all of Al's people, healed the party. Brian Mulroney did it. Other political parties, the winners have gone around shooting the wounded. And leaving that sense of bitterness and exclusion that makes it very difficult then to recover and to have a healthy party. I once said to Brian, the Conservative caucus is by nature at least was in those days, a very factious group. You would go to caucus each Wednesday, because you weren't sure there was going to be one the following Wednesday. Liberals had a fascination with power and how you could gain it, how you could hold it. The Conservatives had a fascination with infighting with each other, and particularly with whoever was leader.
Attendance through curiosity.
And I once said to Brian, everybody talks about your achievement in winning 2 back-to-back majorities. I believe that your single most important achievement is being able to hold the Conservative caucus together in all this time. Ultimately, the caucus fractured. You saw the Reform Party growing on the right. And of course Lucien Bouchard created the Bloc Québécois. But he was extraordinary in building coalitions. He was the best manager of people I've ever met in my life. Even when we were down in the polls to somewhere near single digits, members of caucus would have crawled over broken glass to support him. I have never seen anybody who was better in terms of developing relationships, who was sincere about it, who genuinely cared for people, but for whom this was an important part of his politics as well. He developed a genuine friendship. You look at the leaders of the G7, Kohl, Mitterrand, Thatcher, Reagan. First of all, Brian Mulroney was the only foreigner who was asked to speak. The only foreign leader who was asked to speak at Reagan's funeral and at Bush's funeral because of the close personal relationship they had. And they built these ties where the leaders would spend political capital for each other, both because they believed in what the other believed in, but also because of the intense personal connection. I remember being home on a Saturday night, watching Saturday Night at the Movies on TVO, the phone ringing and picking it up and hearing Perrin, it's Brian. I just wanted to call you to say that Mila saw you in the house this week and said you did a great job. And my reaction on at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night was to say, Prime Minister G, thanks a lot for calling, but this really wasn't necessary for you to do this on Saturday night. And his response was, well, I think it was. I think it was important that you know that I feel that way. He's just constantly reaching out to people. So part of his success in building a new coalition in Quebec was that he developed his relationship with Robert Bourassa after he had been premier the first time and was defeated and was an outcast. Brian Mulroney reached out to him and developed a personal friendship that when Bourassa came back into office allowed them to build a formidable federalist coalition. he would reach out. Bob Ray will tell you that when his brother died, that one of the first phone calls he got was from Brian Mulrooney. And this wasn't something Brian did for show. There was no publicity about it. It was because he genuinely cared and was reaching out to somebody who wasn't from his political background. He treated others with generosity and with respect. And he was a unifier in that sense. He believed that the role of a political leader has to be to bring people in. Politics today instead has become much more exclusionary. It's how do you divide, how do you foment anger and profit from it, and how do you play to your base and then wedge the opposition. In those days, particularly for the Conservative Party, we knew that we were the minority party, and the only way that we could win was by reaching out and bringing in people who didn't belong before. That was Brian Mulrooney's instinct always. And then he was somebody who believed that, too often with politicians, they want office for the sake of holding office. Mulrooney wanted office for the sake of what he could do with the office, how he could use it to make a difference. And he was prepared to lead public opinion, as he did on free trade, and as he did on the GST, and as he did on Meech Lake, and as he did on South Africa and on so many other issues. And so often he was guided by instincts that were simply humane. I was there. This was something that was never written up. Nobody else was there. I was there when Ronald Reagan came to Ottawa. He was to speak to Parliament, and the Prime Minister hosted a luncheon at 24 Sussex with about a half dozen members of the U.S. cabinet and a half dozen members of ours. And it was fascinating to me to be there, to see the relationship between Mulrooney and Reagan. And the discussion was quite wide-ranging, but it got to South Africa, where our position was absolutely the opposite of Margaret Thatcher's, and where Ronald Reagan had certainly not bought into seeing Nelson Mandela as a good guy. And I remember Brian turning to Ronald Reagan during the lunch and saying, "Ron, these people are Nazis. They're on their way out. And the United States has to be on the right side of history." Reagan took no offense to that. He didn't respond to it directly, but he took no offense. And what it brought home to me was this was the sort of thing you could say only to a friend. If the relationship had been a formal, structured one, you could not have been that direct. We opposed the Reagan position on Nicaragua, for example. South Africa was another example. But all of this was founded on a position of trust in each other. And Mulrooney was quite prepared to use those relationships to promote ideas and principles that he believed were the right ones. And South Africa, Canada was a leader on the right side of the issue. The other private moment that I remember was when caucus was torn on the issue of gay rights. I forget exactly what the issue of the day was, but the Charter of Rights was in. The government was determined to bring legislation into line with the Charter, but it was very divisive within caucus. And I remember Brian's comment was very simple. He said, "I can't bring myself to hate somebody on the basis of who they love." This was simply a very humane reaction on his part. It wasn't calculated. It was on the basis of his humanity. And that should be what guides our politicians. We should be looking to repair the tears in our national fabric. We should be looking to have a government that governs for everybody and not just for their own partisan followers. And we should have a government that is prepared to lead and is led by itself by principle and not by polls. Those are the governments that are transformational and the leaders who are remembered by history.
I'd like to pivot to your role as the head of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce now. And as we talked about beforehand, that's going to be coming to an end in August.
End of August.
End of August. So maybe start sort of briefly about what exactly the Canadian Chamber of Commerce is, to set some context about why you wrote an open letter to the Prime Minister.
Sure. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce is Canada's largest business organization. We represent about 200,000 businesses of every size, every sector, every region of the country through a network of 400 or 450 chambers of commerce and boards of trade across Canada. And it's our role to promote the success of Canadian business and the success of Canadian society as a consequence. So it's been an incredible 17 years. It'll be 17 years as of the end of August when I leave. Yes.
Wow.
And so I have been by far the president who's been at the chamber for the longest time, and I'm going to hate leaving it. But it's the right time for the chamber, and it's the right time for me. We've just come through our best 4 years in the history of the organization. We've doubled our top line in the last 4 years, and we've brought in new services. I think we're more respected than ever before. But we're coming to the end of our strategic plan, and next year will be both our 100th anniversary, and we need to look at the successor plan. And it's the person who's going to be implementing that plan who should be here to lead its development. And that means that that's the right time. It's also the right time for me, in that while I've loved every second that I've been here, there are things that I want to do. And this will give me an opportunity to do different things and to refresh myself intellectually and to try out new experiences and to learn in new ways.
Now, you wrote an open letter to the Prime Minister, which I encourage everybody to read, because there's a lot in the letter that's worth talking about, and we don't have a chance today to go through everything, but maybe start with the reason why you decided to write this open letter and some of the key themes that you wanted to draw out from that.
The reason why I decided to write it is that I believe that Canada's never been more isolated in the world than we are today, that we've had a drift into irrelevance that continues, unfortunately, to the detriment of both Canada and the rest of the world. There's a key role that we can play that's beneficial to us and beneficial to others as well, and that it's reversible. But it's reversible only if we do an honest assessment of where we are today and of what needs to be done to actually resume a position of influence in the world where we're actually making a difference for the better.
I like one of the things you say in this, and is any company that did 2/3 of its business with one customer would spare no effort to maintain and strengthen that relationship. Referring to Canada's trade with the U.S., and I think that's a great perspective as to taking the reality of the business world and superimposing that on the way Canada has its relationship or operates with the U.S. I mean, what would you like to see improved in that regard to better align to that sort of business philosophy that you outlined?
The first thing that you need to do with any element of foreign policy is to do a clear-headed assessment of what are the threats, what are the opportunities, and what are your strategic priorities. Not our relationship with countries our relationships aren't all equal. I used to say only half facetiously when I was foreign minister that Canada has two international relationships, one with the United States and one with the rest of the world. That's obviously an overstatement. But the fact is that we are aligned in defense. We are aligned in commerce. We are aligned culturally. We are aligned politically. We have so many interests that align with one another, that are beneficial for Canada if they are managed well, and that can be very damaging to us if they're not. And that we have to recognize that much of the clout that we had years ago in the rest of the world came from the influence that we had with the United States. I mentioned, for example, the ability to speak truth to power when Brian Mulroney spoke directly to Ronald Reagan about issues like South Africa or Nicaragua. But when George Bush became president, it was Brian Mulroney who persuaded him that before the first Gulf War, he should seek the approval of the United Nations. So there genuinely was international consent for the Americans to move, as opposed to this being some sort of American unilateralism. We had that influence because of the strength of the relationship. It's easy with the best relationships to take them for granted, to assume that because they're good, they'll be there forever. But the lesson that we should learn is that when you start to ignore relationships instead of investing in them, they begin to deteriorate and you drift apart. And that certainly happened with the United States. If we go back a few years, Americans saw the relationship with Canada as being strategic. We belong to clubs that they don't belong to. We can speak to people that they can't speak to. We can assist in providing a bridge between North America and the rest of the world. That's the strategic role that we could play, and we were part of a highly integrated North American economy as well, that was under siege from other parts of the world. That strategic relationship is deteriorated into one that's transactional. It's polite, it's formal. We're not going to war with each other, but issues are being decided now on the basis of each issue as a standalone issue, not of how it fits into a broader picture. And in each of these issues, when they're decided in Washington, they're decided on the basis of domestic politics, rather than on the basis of how does this move ahead the American strategic position more broadly. This works very much to Canada's disadvantage. And we have the renewal of CUSMA coming up, where the three countries are going to have to decide whether or not to reopen it and go back into very difficult negotiations, or to continue on with it the way that it's been. And we also can rebuild a relationship with the U.S. where we have influence that goes way beyond our numbers and way beyond the size of our economy, if we do it well. But this won't happen spontaneously. You have to work at it, and we have to move away from today. When the President of the United States arrives in Ottawa, the Prime Minister of Canada will meet him or her and say, Madam President, Mr. President, welcome to Canada. I've got a list here of the things that we need you to fix, and there'd be a long, niggly list of. Condoleezza Rice used to say that meeting with Canadians was like a meeting of the Condominium Association. And there's some justice to that. What we have to do is to be able to say, welcome to Canada, Mr. President or Madam President. We've got some solutions for some of the problems that you're dealing with, and this is win-win. We did that with the Smart Border Accord after 9/11. That was a Canadian idea that John Manley took to the United States, and that allowed us to reopen the border. We're the smaller country. We need to be the demandeur, the ones with the ideas, and they need to be win-win. Instead, increasingly, our trips to Washington have been to beg the Americans to exempt us from whatever the latest punitive policy is that they're looking at. We cannot win on the basis of a transactional relationship. It has to be strategic once again. And the same applies to a lesser extent with the rest of the world as well.
Thank you very much for your time today. And the last question that I ask everybody is if they have a recommendation for the listener that could educate, entertain, or inspire. And that could be a book that you're reading, a show you're watching, a restaurant that you particularly enjoy, or maybe a cause that's of particular interest to you.
Let me give you three.
Wonderful.
One of the things I want to do after the end of August is to find more time to be able to read. So my reading tends to be reports and short-form articles, newspapers or magazines and other documents like that. I hope to be able to do much more reading of books, and particularly biographies. One of the ones that I most enjoyed was a two-part series about Clare Boothe Luce in the United States, who was the wife of Henry Luce, who was the publisher of Time magazine. but an extraordinary woman, born to a single mother, who made her own way, who was elected at 39 to the U.S. House of Representatives, who was a playwright, an editor, a writer, an actor. She politician. She was Eisenhower's appointee as ambassador to Italy after the war. An extraordinary, formidable intellect. She was often referred to as the smartest person in the House of Representatives, with an acerbic wit, but with a life that was marred by human tragedy as well. She lost her daughter when in a car accident when she was 19. Her marriage to Henry Luce was extremely difficult, and at one point she attempted suicide. She experimented with LSD back in the 1960s. So it's a very complex life. It was amazing. She was on the Armed Forces Committee of House of Representatives and went over to Europe during the war, where she, among other things, courted one of the married generals who was there, and she sent missives back from the front. She was such a remarkable, beautiful woman and a striking personality that there was enormous coverage of the fact that she was there. And Dorothy Porter referred to her missives as all Claire on the Western Front. So fascinating in her complexity, the things that she achieved, but also the ghosts that were there through this time as well. The first book, which was written by Sylvia Jukes Morris, was called, I believe, Rage for Fame, and the second one, Price of Fame. The second one starts with her arriving in Washington to take up her seat in the House of Representatives, that she resigned from just a few years later, saying politics is a refuge for the second-rate mind. So that, fascinating woman, way ahead of her time, complex, and somebody who was an achiever in so many different ways. In terms of a guilty pleasure, the Ottawa Jazz Fest, which will be coming up again this year in June. It is incredible to be able to sit outside downtown Ottawa at night and to see these world-class performers. And there's an intimacy to the setting, and it's the beginning of summer. And it just is a wonderful opportunity for people to just savor where we are in the year and some of the blessings of being in the national capital. So we go to each year. We have dinner with friends beforehand, and then the four of us go to watch the performance. This in the past, it's been people like Feist, for example, that we've seen, but first-rate performers. Then, in terms of what could be inspiring or edifying, public service in one form or another. And I guess the point that I'd leave for your listeners is that it need not be running for elective office. You were motivated by a desire to serve your country through your professional career. It's a vital form of public service, and we can serve our community and our country in 1,000 different ways that may involve politics and may not. So there are enormous opportunities there. But what always motivated me was the feeling that one day I would be 75 or 80, and you don't get a redo. If you're focused only on yourself and on material comforts or on whatever the passing pleasure of the day is, it would be a terrible thing to look back in your final years and say, I took the most important resource that I had, which is my time, and I didn't use it to make a difference for the better. So if there's one message I can leave, that to find a way to put back into the community and to leave things better for the fact that you've been there, then the rewards of that are enormous.
That's a perfect way to end. Thank you for your time today, Perrin.
Thank you for having me.
find information in the show notes on the history of Beatty Brothers Limited, Perrin's letter to the Prime Minister, and his recommendations on reading, entertainment, and service. Thanks for listening, and goodbye until next time.